There are no fingerprints on the gun. I just want you to sit with that for a moment before we go any further.
On the night of June 16, 1959, a gun was fired in a bedroom in Benedict Canyon. The gun had no fingerprints on it. The 3 people in the house waited 45 minutes before calling the police. The investigation lasted days. The case was closed. And the man who was found dead, the man whose bedroom it was, whose gun it supposedly was, whose death the official version requires you to accept as a self-inflicted wound despite the physical impossibility of the evidence, that man spent 6 years wearing a cape on television. And the cape is what everyone remembers. The fingerprints are what nobody talks about. I'm going to talk about the fingerprints. This is not a story about Superman. I need to say that clearly before we go any further, because every telling of my story eventually becomes a story about Superman, about the trap of the costume and the curse of the role and the man who couldn't escape the character. And while all of that is true, it is also, in the context of what actually happened on June 16th, a distraction. The useful kind of distraction, the kind that gives people somewhere comfortable to look while the uncomfortable thing sits right there in the police report. A gun with no fingerprints. A casing found under a body that had to have been there before the body fell. 45 minutes of silence in a house where a man had just been found dead. These are not the details of an unwitnessed death. These are the details of something else entirely. And the something else was never investigated. I was 45 years old. I had a career that was complicated and a life that was more than the cape, and a death that deserved more than 3 days of inquiry, and a preferred version distributed to the press before the body was cold. What I'm giving you now is the version that didn't get distributed, the one that follows the evidence instead of the narrative, the one that asks the questions the investigation declined to ask, the one told by the only person in this story who has absolutely nothing left to lose by telling it straight. I'm already gone. The fingerprints are still missing. Let's talk about what that means. It's almost 2 in the morning. I've gone to bed. My fiancée is downstairs with 2 guests, people I know, people who've been in my house before, people who are drinking my liquor and talking too loud for that hour. I hear them. I come back downstairs. I say something. There are different versions of what I said depending on who you ask, and the fact that there are different versions should already be telling you something. I go back upstairs. And then, according to the 3 people left in that house, the 3 people who waited 45 minutes before calling the police, there is a single gunshot. 45 minutes. I want to keep coming back to that number, because it's the number that the official version never adequately explains. Not 30 seconds of shock, not 5 minutes of panic. 45 minutes. In that house, with a man lying dead upstairs, 3 people who knew him sat downstairs for 45 minutes before anyone picked up the telephone. The coroner would later rule it an isolated incident. The investigation lasted, and I use that word generously, a matter of days. The case was closed. The gun with no fingerprints was logged as evidence, and the question of how a man ends up dead without leaving prints on the weapon was apparently not considered worth pursuing. I'm going to tell you what I know. I'm going to tell you what the evidence says and what it doesn't say, and where the holes are, because the holes are the whole story. I'm not going to tell you who did it. I genuinely don't know, and anyone who tells you they do is selling something. What I can tell you is what I know about the people in that house that night, what I know about the months that led to that night, and what I know about a town that was very good at making inconvenient things go away quickly. Hollywood in 1959 had been doing that for a long time. It had a lot of practice. Let me go back. Not to the beginning, I'll get to the beginning, but to the moment just before everything calcified into something I couldn't get out of. 1951. I'm in my late 30s. I've been working in Hollywood for 15 years. I've done pictures that nobody remembers and some that people remember for the wrong reasons. And I'm a working actor in the specific, unglamorous sense of that phrase. Employed, competent, not a star, not broke, Just a man doing a job in a town that has very strong opinions about what your job says about your worth as a human being. I've been in enough rooms to know how those opinions work. I've been ranked and categorized and found adequate. Adequate was the word that followed me. Then the television show. A children's program. A man in a cape. A character that children across America were going to watch every week and take seriously in the way that only children can take something seriously. Completely, without irony, without the self-protective distance that adults bring to everything. I knew what I was walking into. I wasn't naive about it. The money was real, and the work was steady, and in 1951, those two things mattered more than the costume looked on camera. What I didn't fully account for, what nobody sat me down and explained with the specificity it deserved, was what it means to become that fixed in the public imagination. Not famous, fixed. There's a difference. Famous means people know your name. Fixed means they can only see you one way, and every other way you try to show them gets filtered back through the one way they already have. I was the man in the cape. I was going to be the man in the cape for the rest of my career and possibly the rest of my life, and there was not a single thing I could do about it that wouldn't look like ingratitude or instability or both. The show ran for 6 seasons. I directed episodes. I became, in ways that had nothing to do with the character and everything to do with the work, genuinely good at what I was doing. But when the show ended and I went back to trying to build the career I'd had before, the rooms I walked into had already made up their minds. They'd seen me in the cape. That was the data they were working from. The casting directors were polite. The producers were regretful. The parts didn't come. And in the months before June of 1959, I was a man who understood with increasing clarity that the thing that had kept him employed for 6 years had also made him unemployable. There are 2 women in this story, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because you already know there are 2 women, and dancing around it would waste both our time. The first one I'm going to call the older woman. She was connected, wealthy. The kind of connected and wealthy that in Hollywood in the 1950s meant her social world overlapped with people who could make things happen and people who could make things stop happening. We were together for years. It was not a simple arrangement, and I won't reduce it to one. There was genuine feeling in it on both sides, and there was also a power imbalance that I understood clearly and lived with anyway, because the alternative was a kind of loneliness I didn't have the appetite for at that point in my life. She had a husband. The husband was not a passive figure. He was a man with connections of his own, a man who moved in circles where the word that gets used is influence. And influence in that context means the specific ability to cause problems for people who cause problems for you. I'm not going to tell you he was responsible for what happened to me. I don't know that. What I can tell you is that he was not happy, that his unhappiness was known to people who knew both of us, and that in a town where unhappy, powerful men had historically been accommodated by various means, his unhappiness was a variable in the equation. I want to be precise about that. A variable, not a conclusion. The second woman was my fiancée, younger, present in my house on the night of June 16th. The person whose account of that night became the primary account because she was there and I was not available to offer a competing one. She called me despondent. She said I'd been expressing dark thoughts about the future. She described a man in decline, a man losing his grip, a man moving toward an ending. And here is what I want you to hold on to. Some of what she said was probably true. I was not happy in those months. The career was stalling. The cape was following me everywhere, and I was a man in his mid-40s watching the version of his life he'd planned recede in the rearview mirror. All of that is true. What is also true is that a man can be unhappy and also not be responsible for his own death. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. The people who needed the suicide ruling to hold didn't want you thinking too hard about the distance between them. Here's the thing about playing a hero that nobody tells you before you put the costume on. The hero doesn't belong to you. The hero belongs to every kid who ever watched the show with a bowl of cereal in his lap on a Saturday morning. Every kid who tied a towel around his neck and jumped off the back porch. Every kid who needed something invulnerable to believe in, because the world around him was not. That hero is theirs. You're just the body inside the costume. And when the body inside the costume tries to do something else, tries to be a different kind of actor in a different kind of story, those kids, now grown, look at you with a specific betrayal in their eyes that has nothing to do with your actual performance and everything to do with what you represent to the child they used to be. I tested it. After the show ended, I went to a theater to see a picture, a regular movie theater, a man trying to have a private evening, and someone recognized me and pointed, and the children in the audience turned and looked. And what happened next is the thing I carry. They laughed. Not meanly, I want to be fair about this, not with cruelty, but with the particular helpless laughter of people confronted with an absurdity. Superman in a movie theater. Superman eating popcorn. Superman with a slightly receding hairline and a sport coat and the specific posture of a man who is tired and just wanted to watch a picture in peace. The laughter was the kindest possible version of what that moment meant. What it meant was, you are a joke now. Not a bad person, not a failed actor, a joke. And there is no costume in the world that fits over that. The last months of the show, I was directing as much as acting. I'd pushed for that, earned it, found in the directing a version of the work that felt like it still had somewhere to go. I was good at it. I knew how a set worked, how to talk to a camera crew, how to get a performance out of someone who was phoning it in. I had skills that had nothing to do with the cape and everything to do with 15 years of showing up and paying attention. The directing was the door I thought I could walk through, not back into films exactly, but into a career that was still a career, still moving forward, still something I could point to and say, this is what I do. The door kept not opening. The cape kept being in the way. And in June of 1959, I was standing in a hallway full of closed doors, which is a terrible place to be. But difficult circumstances and a violent end are not the same thing. Let me walk you through it. Not the emotional version, the factual one. The version that the physical evidence either supports or doesn't. Because that's where this story lives or dies, and I want you to be able to follow the logic yourself, rather than just take my word for it. The gun was found between my feet. That's the first thing. When a person is killed by a gunshot at close range, the discharge typically causes the hand to release. The physics of it, the force, the involuntary muscular response. The gun does not stay neatly between the feet of the person who fired it. It moves. Guns move. That's not a theory. That's ballistics. And the position of the weapon at the scene was noted and then somehow not considered a sufficient reason to slow down the process of settling on a cause of death. The shell casing was found under my body. Under, which means it was there before I fell, which means the sequence of events the ruling requires, man dies by his own hand, falls, casing lands under him, does not hold up against the physical reality of where things were in that room. A casing lands where it lands at the moment of discharge. It does not travel under a body that has already fallen on top of it. The investigators noted this. They noted it the way you note something you have decided not to pursue, the way you write something down in order to have a record of having written it down without actually doing anything about what it means. And then the fingerprints. Or rather, the absence of them. A gun that has been fired by a person will carry that person's prints, or it will carry evidence that it was wiped, or it will carry the confused, overlapping prints of multiple people. What it will not do, under normal circumstances, is simply have no prints at all, as if it materialized in that room without anyone ever having touched it. The official ruling did not explain the missing prints. It noted them and moved on. And that moving on, that institutional, deliberate, professionally accomplished moving on, is the clearest thing in this entire story. Someone decided very early that this case was going to close. The evidence was not going to be allowed to complicate that decision. In Hollywood, in 1959, that kind of decision got made all the time. The machinery was very practiced at it. I just didn't expect to be on the receiving end of it quite so permanently. I keep coming back to the number. I can't help it. 45 minutes is not a unit of time that fits naturally into any version of the suicide narrative. Not the shock version, not the panic version, not the we didn't know what to do version. 45 minutes is a specific and deliberate amount of time. It is long enough to do things. It is long enough to make decisions about what the scene looks like when the police arrive. It is long enough to have a conversation about what everyone is going to say. I am not telling you that is what happened in those 45 minutes. I am telling you that 45 minutes is what happened, and that the 3 people in that house that night never provided an account of those 45 minutes that satisfied anyone who looked at it carefully. The fiancé's story shifted. Not dramatically, not in the ways that make investigators sit up and take notice in the movies, but in the small, accumulated ways that stories shift when they are being managed rather than remembered. Details that changed between the first account and the second. A sequence of events that rearranged itself slightly between tellings. The kind of inconsistencies that a good investigator treats as a thread worth pulling, and that the investigators assigned to this case treated as the normal variation of traumatized witness testimony. Both interpretations are possible. One of them is more convenient than the other. The investigation consistently chose the more convenient one. The 2 guests, the people who were there, who heard the shot, who sat in that house for 45 minutes before anyone called the police, were interviewed briefly and released. They left Los Angeles shortly after. They were not, as far as the public record shows, interviewed again in any serious way, as the questions about the case continued to accumulate over the following months and years. In a different investigation, in a case that someone with authority had decided to actually pursue, those 2 people would have been the center of the inquiry. In this investigation, they were peripheral. Witnesses who had been present at the scene of a death that was being ruled a suicide were treated as peripheral. That tells you something about what kind of investigation this was. It tells you something about who needed it to be over quickly, and how much of that need the investigators were willing to accommodate. The industry knew within hours. That's how it worked in that town. The information moved through certain channels faster than it moved through the official ones. And by the time the police report was filed and the coroner had done his work, the people who needed to know already knew and had already begun the process of deciding what knowing meant for them professionally and personally. I had been, in the years of the show, a visible enough figure that my death was going to be a story. The question was what kind of story? And in Hollywood in 1959, the difference between a story that damaged people and a story that didn't was almost entirely a function of how quickly and how completely the preferred version got established. The preferred version was available immediately. It had all the elements a preferred version needs. A man under pressure, a career stalling, a temperament described by people who knew him as volatile, a history of drinking that could be called upon selectively to suggest instability, a fiancé who was present and grieving, and whose account of the preceding weeks painted a picture of a man in a dark place. The preferred version was tidy. It had internal logic. It did not require anyone to ask uncomfortable questions about who else was in that house, and what they were doing for 45 minutes, and why a gun found at the scene carried none of that man's fingerprints. The preferred version closed the case. The preferred version protected people who needed protecting. The preferred version was what Hollywood produced when it needed a narrative quickly and the truth was inconvenient. What I want you to understand, what I think is the most important thing in this entire account, is that the people who produced that preferred version were not monsters. They were professionals. They were people who had learned, over long careers in a town that ran on the management of image and the suppression of inconvenience, that certain things get handled in certain ways, and that the handling is clean and fast and leaves very little behind for anyone to find later. The studio system had been doing this since the silent era. By 1959, it had refined the process to something close to an art form. My death was not the first inconvenient thing Hollywood made disappear. It was not the last. It was just the one I happened to be personally involved in.
Here is where I have to be honest with you, in a way that the rest of this account hasn't required. I don't know who is responsible for what happened to me. If it was the older woman's husband, I don't have proof. If it was someone acting on someone else's behalf, I don't know whose. If it was my fiancé, alone or with the help of the two guests, I can't tell you how or why with the certainty that a name deserves. What I can tell you is what the evidence rules out, and what the evidence rules out is the version that was filed. The version that was filed requires a gun to discharge without being handled, requires a casing to travel backwards under a falling body, requires a man to be found dead without leaving any trace of his hand on the weapon near him. That version is not physically possible. Everything else, every other version, every other arrangement of people and motives and 45 minutes remains open. The investigation that would have been required to close those other versions was never conducted. That is the fact I keep returning to. The fact underneath all the other facts, the structural fact of this case. Not that the evidence pointed one way and was ignored, though it was. Not that witnesses gave inconsistent accounts and weren't pressed, though they weren't. The foundational problem is that the investigation was over before it started. That someone with the authority to determine how much scrutiny this death would receive made a determination very early, and that determination was not much. In a town where the distance between a thorough investigation and a cursory one was often measured in who knew whom and what they needed, this case got the cursory version. I was entitled to the thorough one. I didn't get it.
What I got instead was a footnote. The man who played Superman, found dead at 45, case closed with no clear answers.
The cape got more coverage than the questions. The character outlasted the investigation into the death of the man who played him. That is the specific and complete irony of my situation. That the thing I spent the last decade of my life trying to escape became the thing I'm remembered for, and the thing I actually needed people to pay attention to, the actual circumstances of my actual death, got buried under the weight of a costume I never wanted to be defined by in the first place. I was a good actor. I was a careful director. I was a man who deserved better than 45 minutes and a closed case and a preferred version. I'm still waiting for someone to say that out loud and mean it. So here we are. The case is still closed. The gun still has no fingerprints. The 45 minutes are still unaccounted for. The 3 people who were in that house that night gave their accounts and were released, and the investigation that should have followed did not follow. And 60-some years later, the official version is still the official version, because official versions, once established with sufficient speed and institutional backing, develop a kind of gravity that is very hard to escape. Not impossible, just hard.
And nobody, in the specific case of what happened to me, has ever applied the sustained force required to escape it.
What I want to ask you, what I want you to actually sit with before you move on to the next thing, is this. How many closed cases are closed because they're solved? And how many are closed because closing them was convenient for someone with the authority to decide? Because Hollywood in 1959 was not unique in its ability to make inconvenient things disappear quickly. It was just unusually practiced at it, unusually connected, unusually protected by the specific overlap between money and influence and the kind of institutional inertia that makes a 3-day investigation into a suspicious death look, from a sufficient distance, like due diligence. Every system that runs on image and money and the management of inconvenience has this capacity. Hollywood just did it in public, in front of everyone. and everyone looked at the cape instead of the fingerprints. I played a hero for 6 years. Heroes, in the version of the world the show was selling, solve things. They find the truth, they name the guilty party, they restore order. I spent 6 years embodying that promise for children who needed it, and I died in a room where none of it applied. Where the truth was inconvenient, the guilty party was protected, and the order that was restored was the order that served the people who needed the case closed. If there is any justice in any of this, it is that I'm still here talking about it. The preferred version got established, the cape got remembered. But the fingerprints are still missing, and the 45 minutes are still unaccounted for. And this story is still open, regardless of what the file says. Share it. Talk about it. Ask the question that the investigation wouldn't ask. Someone should.